He looked her up and down, taking in her plain muslin dress, and sneered that a duke could not marry a penniless nobody. He broke her heart for a wealthy heiress. But what his grace didn't know was that the nobody he just rejected owned the very bank foreclosing on his ancestral estate. The London season of 1889 was a glittering spectacle of wealth lineage and desperate social climbing, masked behind the polite rustle of silk and the sharp clink of crystal champagne flutes. At the epicenter of this gilded circus stood Frederick Cavendish, the 9th Duke of Rothmere. To the casual observer in the opulent ballroom of the Devonshire house, Frederick was the epitome of aristocratic perfection. Tall, strikingly handsome, and possessing a title that dated back to the Norman Conquest, he was the most eligible bachelor in England. But beneath the impeccably tailored tuxedo and the arrogant tilt of his jaw lay a deeply guarded, humiliating secret. The Rothmere fortune was completely, irrecoverably gone. Generations of gambling mismanagement and the plunging agricultural revenues of the late 19th century had left Frederick with a crumbling ancestral seat, Dunhaven Castle, and a mountain of debt that threatened to swallow him whole. His presence in London this season was not for pleasure. It was a hunting expedition. He needed a bride with a massive dowry to save his family's legacy. He had no room for romance, and certainly no room for a woman without a fortune. It was during a waltz at Lady Fitzwilliam's mid-season gala that he first noticed her. She was entirely out of place amidst the peacocking debutantes, dripping in inherited diamonds. She wore a simple, unadorned gown of pale blue muslin, her dark hair swept up in a modest twist without a single jewel to catch the chandelier's light. Yet she possessed a quiet, magnetic dignity that drew his eye immediately. When Frederick finally secured an introduction through a mutual acquaintance, he learned her name was Genevieve Hayes. "Just Miss Hayes," she had said, with a polite, enigmatic smile when he inquired about her family. "I am here as the paid companion to the Dowager Lady Agatha of Cornwall. I ensure she takes her medicine, and I read to her when her eyes tire. A paid companion. A servant, essentially." Frederick's rigid aristocratic upbringing flared, warning him to step away. But as the evening progressed, he found himself entirely captivated. They retreated to the terrace, escaping the stifling heat of the ballroom, and engaged in a conversation unlike any he had ever experienced. Genevieve did not giggle behind a painted fan or feign ignorance to flatter his ego. She spoke intelligently of the booming industrial railroads in America, of art, and of the political shifts in Europe. Her mind was as sharp as a diamond, and by the time the clock struck midnight, Frederick felt a dangerous, unfamiliar fluttering in his chest. For 3 weeks, Frederick broke his own rules. He sought out Genevieve at every society function. They stole moments in the hedge mazes of Hyde Park and shared intense, lingering glances across crowded dining rooms. The gossips of London began to whisper. Why was the proud Duke of Rothmere wasting his time with a penniless orphan when he was supposed to be courting the immensely wealthy Lady Arabella Wentworth? The whispers eventually reached the ears of Frederick's closest confidant, Lord Nathaniel Brooks. "You are playing a dangerous game," Frederick Nathaniel warned one evening as they shared cigars in the smoky lounge of the exclusive White's Club. "The girl is charming, I will grant you that. But she has absolutely nothing to her name. The creditors are circling Dunhaven. Lady Arabella's father owns half the iron mills in Yorkshire and is prepared to offer a dowry of £200,000. You cannot marry a companion." Frederick's jaw tightened. He knew Nathaniel was right. The crushing weight of his title, the hundreds of tenant farmers depending on him, and the legacy of his ancestors demanded a sacrifice. His heart could not outweigh his duty. The final fracture occurred the following evening at a masquerade ball hosted by the Earl of Pembroke. Frederick had made his decision. He had to sever ties with Genevieve completely and cruelly to force himself toward Arabella. He found Genevieve in the conservatory, surrounded by the heavy, sweet scent of blooming orchids. She looked up at him, her eyes bright with an emotion she had just begun to allow herself to feel. "Frederick," she breathed, stepping toward him. He raised a gloved hand, his face a mask of cold, aristocratic stone. "Miss Hayes, I believe it is time we put an end to this inappropriate distraction." Genevieve stopped her smile, faltering. "Distraction. You must understand your place in the world, and I must understand mine," Frederick said, his voice stripped of the warmth he had shown her for weeks. He forced himself to look at her plain dress, using it as a shield against his own guilt. "A duke's heart is a luxury he cannot afford. I have a legacy to protect. You have no dowry, no standing, no family name. I am to propose to Lady Arabella Wentworth tomorrow." Genevieve stared at him, the colour draining from her cheeks. "You are choosing a woman you do not love for a pile of iron and coin." "I am choosing survival." Frederick snapped his pride, wounded by her judgment. "I cannot marry a penniless nobody. You are simply too poor to be my Duchess." "Good evening, Miss Hayes." He turned on his heel and walked away, leaving her standing alone among the orchids. He expected her to weep. He expected her to run from the party in disgrace. But as Frederick glanced back over his shoulder, he saw something that unsettled him deeply. Genevieve was not crying. Her posture was rigidly straight, her chin held high, and a chilling, almost pitying smile ghosted across her lips. "You measure worth in pounds and pence, Your Grace," she murmured, her voice carrying softly across the empty room. "I pray your ledgers bring you warmth." The next day, Miss Genevieve Hayes vanished from London society. The Dowager Lady Agatha claimed her companion had abruptly resigned and taken a train to the countryside. Frederick buried the ache in his chest, proposed to Lady Arabella Wentworth, and prepared to save his estate. For a time, Frederick believed he had made the right, albeit painful, decision. The engagement to Lady Arabella was announced in the Times, and his creditors, appeased by the promise of the incoming Wentworth iron fortune, temporarily backed away from Dunhaven Castle. But the security was a fragile illusion. In the autumn of 1890, disaster struck the British financial markets. The bearing crisis, triggered by excessive risk-taking in South American investments, sent shockwaves through the city of London. Panic swept the banks. In the ensuing chaos, the Wentworth iron mills, which had been heavily over-leveraged in speculative foreign markets, collapsed overnight. Lady Arabella's father was utterly ruined, his vast fortune turning to dust in a matter of days. With her dowry gone, the Wentworth family quietly withdrew the engagement, fleeing to a modest cottage in the country to hide from their own shame. Frederick was left standing in the rubble of his grand plan. Without the Wentworth dowry, his temporary grace period with his creditors instantly evaporated. The London Continental Bank, the ruthless financial institution that held the mortgages to Dunhaven Castle and the surrounding estates, demanded immediate repayment of £150,000. It was a sum Frederick could not produce if he sold every painting horse and silver spoon to his name. He was given 30 days before the bank would seize his ancestral home, evict him, and sell centuries of Cavendish history to the highest bidder. Desperation drove Frederick to the heart of London's financial district. On a dreary, rain-swept Tuesday, he arrived at the imposing marble headquarters of the London Continental Bank. He swallowed his immense pride, intending to beg the bank's managing director, a stern man named Mr. Harrison, for a restructuring of his debt. He was ushered into a grand oak-panelled waiting room. He paced the floor for an hour, his stomach churning with humiliation. Finally, Mr. Harrison entered, looking remarkably uncomfortable. "Your Grace," Harrison said, bowing slightly. "I apologize for the delay. However, I am afraid I cannot negotiate your mortgages today." Frederick's temper flared. "What do you mean you cannot negotiate? I am the Duke of Wealthier. I demand an extension." "You misunderstand your grace," Harrison said, wiping sweat from his brow. "The bank no longer holds your debt. The board of directors sold your entire portfolio yesterday afternoon. It was purchased in full by our new majority shareholder. She holds the deeds to Dunhaven Castle now." Frederick froze. "She? Who is she?" "She wishes to see you. If you will follow me to the boardroom." Numb with shock, Frederick followed the director down a long corridor. Who could possibly have the capital to buy a £150,000 debt in the middle of a financial crisis? Some vulgar, new-money American heiress looking to collect British titles as trophies. Harrison opened the heavy double doors to the boardroom. "The Duke of Wealthier, madam," he announced, before stepping back and closing the doors, leaving Frederick alone inside. The boardroom was massive, dominated by a long mahogany table. Sitting at the head of the table, silhouetted against the tall windows overlooking the rainy London streets, was a solitary figure. She was dressed not in plain muslin, but in an impeccably tailored gown of deep emerald silk. A fortune in flawless diamonds rested against her throat, catching the grey light of the storm outside. As she turned her chair to face him, the breath was violently knocked from Frederick's lungs. It was Genevieve. Frederick stumbled back a step, gripping the back of a leather chair to steady himself. His mind violently rejected what his eyes were seeing. Miss Hayes," he choked out. "What on earth are you doing here? Are you the secretary to the shareholder?" Genevieve rested her hands on the mahogany table. Her fingers were adorned with an emerald-cut ring the size of a quail's egg. Her expression was completely unreadable, a masterclass in composure. "My name is not Genevieve Hayes." "Your Grace," she said, her voice smooth and carrying a commanding authority he had never heard from the penniless companion. "It is Genevieve Huntington, sole heiress to the Huntington Transatlantic Railway majority shareholder of the London Continental Bank, and as of yesterday at 3 o'clock, the owner of Dunhaven Castle." The room seemed to spin. Frederick collapsed into the nearest chair. Huntington. It was a name whispered with awe in the financial districts of London and New York. The Huntington fortune was staggering, built on miles of American steel and global shipping fleets. It was wealth that dwarfed the Wentworth iron mills 100 times over. I don't understand," Frederick stammered, his aristocratic mask shattering into a million pieces. "Why were you playing the part of a servant? Why lie to me? I did not lie to you to cause you pain," Frederick Genevieve replied, leaning back in her chair. "I grew up surrounded by men who looked at me and saw nothing but bank ledgers and railway shares. I was constantly hunted by impoverished noblemen seeking to trade their dusty titles for my father's hard-earned capital. I wanted to know just once if I could be loved for my mind, my spirit, and my company stripped of my fortune." She stood up slowly, walking around the grand table. The rustle of her heavy silk skirt sounded like a passing storm. "I came to London under my mother's maiden name. Lady Agatha, an old friend of my late father, agreed to help me with the charade. And for a few weeks in those gardens with you, I truly believed I had found a man whose soul recognized mine." She paused, standing just a few feet from him, looking down at his defeated posture. "But when the test came, you proved yourself to be exactly like the rest of them. A man who measures worth in pounds and pence." Frederick closed his eyes, a wave of profound, suffocating regret washing over him. The woman he had genuinely been falling in love with had held the salvation to his family's legacy all along. If he had only been brave enough to choose her to risk his title for love, he would have gained everything. Instead, his cowardice and his snobbery had cost him his heart and his home. "Genevieve, I was desperate," he whispered, looking up at her, shedding the last remnants of his ducal pride. I had an entire estate depending on me. I thought I was doing my duty. Duty? Genevieve scoffed softly, shaking her head. You dismissed me as a nobody. You told me I was too poor to be your Duchess. Tell me, Your Grace, how does it feel to know the penniless nobody now owns the roof over your head? Frederick had no answer. The silence in the opulent boardroom was deafening. He had played the game of high society, flawlessly adhering to every rule of class and wealth, only to find himself completely outmatched by the very woman he had discarded. Genevieve walked back to the head of the table and picked up a thick leather folder. She opened it, revealing the original wax-sealed deeds to Dunhaven Castle. The bank was preparing to foreclose on you next week, auction off your heirlooms, and leave you with nothing, she stated clinically. I purchased the debt to prevent them from doing so. Hope, fragile and desperate, sparked in Frederick's chest. You did. Does that mean you can forgive me? That we can start over? Genevieve looked at him, her eyes softening for a fraction of a second before the steel returned. I bought the debt, Frederick, because, while you may be a snob and a coward, I do not believe centuries of your family's history should be erased by a banking error and a collapsed iron mill. She pulled a gold fountain pen from the desk. But make no mistake, I did not buy this to be your savior. Nor did I buy it to be your Duchess. The contract Genevieve Huntington presented to Frederick was as meticulously constructed as the transatlantic railroads her family had built, alongside the likes of J.P. Morgan and the Vanderbilts. She did not evict the Duke of Rothmere. Instead, she hired him. Frederick was appointed the official estate manager of Dunhaven Castle, completely stripped of his absolute authority. He was given a modest salary, a ledger, and the staggering task of making his ancestral lands profitable under the strict, watchful eye of the woman he had so arrogantly scorned. For the first few months, the humiliation was absolute. Frederick, who had never labored a day in his privileged existence, found himself rising before the sun. Gone were the tailored silk waistcoats and lazy afternoons at the gentlemen's club. Now dressed in rough tweed and heavy riding boots, he spent his days inspecting rotting grain silos, negotiating with tenant farmers, and balancing ledgers that Genevieve ruthlessly audited every fortnight via telegram from London. Then, in the crisp golden autumn of 1891, Genevieve arrived at Dunhaven in person. She did not come alone. Accompanying her was Mr. Oliver Montgomery, a dashing, terrifyingly wealthy American shipping magnate who made no secret of his intention to make Genevieve his wife. Montgomery was everything Frederick was not unburdened by archaic traditions, incredibly modern and perfectly comfortable, treating the Duke of Rothmere as a glorified servant. You have a fascinating little museum here, Rothmere Oliver remarked one evening as they gathered in the grand drawing room after dinner. Oliver stood by the great fireplace, a snifter of brandy in his hand, looking up at the priceless Cavendish family portraits. Genevieve tells me this roof leaked like a sieve before she injected some much-needed New York capital into the masonry. Frederick stood near the door, having just delivered the weekly agricultural reports. His jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. He looked toward Genevieve, who sat gracefully on a velvet settee, reading a volume of poetry. She did not look up, but he saw the faint, guarded tightening of her lips. The roof has sheltered my family for 400 years. Mr. Montgomery Frederick replied, his voice dangerously low. It merely required a moment of attention. Well, it's a good thing Miss Huntington possesses both the attention and the bank book. Oliver laughed, stepping closer to Genevieve and placing a familiar hand on the back of her settee. I keep telling her she ought to sell this crumbling relic and build a modern summer cottage in Newport. The Astors are building one right next to my parcel. Much better society there. Frederick felt a primal, agonizing flare of jealousy. It was not the insult to his home that burned him. It was the proximity of Oliver's hand to Genevieve's shoulder. He remembered the smell of orchids in the London conservatory. He remembered the soft, brilliant light in her eyes when she had believed he cared for her soul, not her status. He had thrown a priceless diamond into the mud, and now another man was casually reaching down to pick it up. "Dunhaven is not for sale, Oliver," Genevieve said, quietly, finally looking up. Her gaze bypassed the American entirely and locked onto Frederick. There was an ocean of unspoken history swimming in her dark eyes, anger, lingering hurt, and something else Frederick could not quite decipher. The Duke has actually improved the crop yields by 12% this quarter. He is working quite hard to prove his worth. His worth. The words echoed in Frederick's mind long after he excused himself to the cold, lonely quarters he now occupied in the East Wing. She was testing him. She was waiting to see if he would break under the indignity, if he would resign and flee back to the shallow comforts of London society. He refused to give her the satisfaction. The next morning, Frederick did not just manage the estate, he immersed himself in it. When a team of draft horses became hopelessly mired in deep mud down by the riverbank, Frederick did not send for the stable-master. He waded into the freezing, waist-deep muck himself, ruining his clothes and straining his muscles to the breaking point to help the labourers free the panicked animals. Genevieve, riding by in her carriage with Oliver, witnessed the entire ordeal. She ordered the carriage to halt. Oliver scoffed at the sight of the Duke, covered head to toe in foul-smelling river mud, wrestling with heavy leather harnesses alongside common field hands. But Genevieve did not laugh. She stared at Frederick's exhausted, mud-streaked face, noting the way the labourers looked at him, no longer with fearful deference, but with genuine, hard-earned respect. For the first time since the night he broke her heart, the ice around Genevieve's soul began to show a hairline fracture. The turning point arrived with the devastating gale of November. It swept off the North Sea with unprecedented fury, battering the English coastline and driving relentless, freezing rain over the Yorkshire moors. By midnight, the River Dun, which snaked through the valley below the castle, breached its banks. The lower village home to 30 tenant families was directly in the path of the surging floodwaters. Frederick was violently awakened by the frantic ringing of the estate bell. He threw on his coat and sprinted to the courtyard where chaos reigned. Lanterns swung wildly in the howling wind. "The levee has broken," Your Grace shouted. Mr. Higgins, the estate foreman, his voice barely carrying over the roar of the storm. "The water is rising into the cottages. The families are trapped on their roofs. Saddle the horses. Bring every rope and cart we have." Frederick roared, his aristocratic polish entirely gone, replaced by the fierce protective instinct of a man fighting for his people. As he swung onto his stallion, he saw Genevieve rushing down the grand staircase into the courtyard, a heavy wool cloak thrown over her nightgown. Oliver Montgomery was trailing behind her, looking utterly appalled. "Genevieve, get back inside. It's madness out here," Oliver yelled, pulling at her arm. "Let the local authorities handle it." Genevieve shook him off, her eyes fixed on Frederick. "What is happening?" "The river is taking the village," Frederick shouted over the wind, calming his panicked horse. "Stay here, Genevieve. Keep the Great Hall warm and prepare blankets and medical supplies. We will bring the families up to the castle." Without waiting for her response, Frederick spurred his horse into the roaring darkness. The village was a nightmare of churning, debris-filled black water. For 6 agonizing hours, Frederick worked like a man possessed. He waded into chest-high, freezing rapids, tying ropes around terrified children and hauling them to the safety of the heavy carts. He dragged livestock from drowning barns and carried elderly women on his back through the treacherous currents. The freezing water numbed his limbs, and falling timber battered his ribs. But he did not stop. As dawn broke, casting a grey, bruised light over the flooded valley, the last family was pulled from the wreckage. Frederick, completely exhausted, shivering violently, and bleeding from a gash on his forehead, led the procession of survivors up the steep hill to Dunhaven Castle. When the heavy oak doors swung open, Genevieve was there. She had transformed the grand entrance hall into a triage centre. She directed the servants to distribute dry clothes and hot broth, ignoring the mud tracking over her priceless Persian rugs. Oliver Montgomery stood on the staircase, his arms crossed, completely detached from the human suffering around him. "Well," Oliver muttered, looking at the soaking, miserable peasants ruining the decor. "I suppose the estate value has just plummeted." Genevieve turned slowly her face, a mask of cold, terrifying fury. "Mr. Montgomery," she said, her voice cutting through the noise of the hall like a razor. "Pack your bags. My carriage will take you to the railway station immediately. You disgust me." Oliver stammered, entirely caught off guard, but Genevieve had already turned her back on him. She rushed across the hall, pushing through the crowd until she reached Frederick. He was leaning heavily against a stone pillar, gasping for breath, his skin a terrifying shade of pale blue. "Frederick," she breathed, abandoning all formality. She reached out her hands, trembling as she touched his freezing, mud-caked cheek. "You are hurt. The tenants." Frederick choked out his teeth, chattering uncontrollably. "Are they all accounted for?" "They are safe. Because of you," she said softly, her eyes filling with tears. She grabbed his arm, draping it over her shoulder. "Come with me. You need a fire and a physician." She personally helped him up the stairs to his chambers, dismissing the servants who offered to assist. In the quiet warmth of his room, she sat by his bedside as the estate doctor stitched his forehead and wrapped his bruised ribs. When the doctor finally left, an intense, heavy silence settled over the room. Frederick looked at her from the pillows. He had nothing left to hide behind. His title meant nothing in the face of the river, and his pride had been washed away in the flood. "I was wrong, Genevieve," he whispered, his voice raspy. "I told you a duke's heart was a luxury, but the truth was, I was just a coward, terrified of losing my status. I chose a crumbling castle over the greatest woman I have ever known, and I have spent every single day since you bought my debt, hating myself for it." Genevieve looked down at her hands, twisting the enormous emerald ring on her finger. "When I first came to London, I wanted to be loved for myself," she said quietly. "But when I bought Dunhaven, I did it out of spite. I wanted to punish you. I wanted to watch the proud Duke break under the weight of working for the woman he deemed too poor." She looked up, meeting his exhausted, honest gaze. The tears finally spilled over her lashes. "But you didn't break, Frederick. You changed. The man who told me I was a nobody would never have risked his life in freezing water to save a farmer's child. You shed the Duke to become a man." She reached out, taking his battered, calloused hand in hers. "And that man is someone I have never stopped loving." Frederick's breath caught in his throat. He weakly pulled her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles with a reverence he had never shown to any royal. "I am entirely at your mercy, Genevieve. I have nothing to offer you but myself." A beautiful, radiant smile broke across Genevieve's face. She leaned down, her forehead resting against his. "I have enough money for the both of us, Frederick. I just needed to know you had the heart." 3 months later, the society pages of the Times announced the most shocking wedding of the decade. The Duke of Rothmere did not marry a British aristocrat. He married Miss Genevieve Huntington, an American heiress of unimaginable wealth. But those who attended the intimate ceremony at Dunhaven Castle knew the truth. It was not a marriage of commerce, nor a desperate bid to save an estate. It was the union of a woman who proved that true worth cannot be measured in ledgers, and a man who learned that the greatest nobility lies not in a title but in the humility to change for love. Did Frederick's redemption move you? True love requires shedding our deepest pride, and this story proves that the greatest wealth is a humbled heart. If you loved this dramatic tale of class betrayal and second chances, please hit that like button, share it with your fellow romance lovers, and subscribe to our channel. We bring you sweeping real-life historical dramas every single week. Drop a comment below. Would you have forgiven the Duke or left him in ruin?